Everyone, welcome back. And we're talking about cramming today. I'm traveling here in Sydney and I'm in a hotel traveling, which means, therefore, the type of content I'm making is this interview style. So, Steph, what question do we have about cramming?
So, what are your thoughts on cramming, just in general?
Okay, so I did an episode yesterday actually with a team that talked about just whether I think cramming is like overrated or underrated or properly rated, Gary V style. This is going to be a controversial and probably surprising answer for a lot of people, is I actually believe cramming in the general sense is actually underrated. So here's a reason, right? And I think it's actually very nuanced because it really does depend on how you're cramming. The good thing about cramming is that it forces you to study a lot of content in a short period of time. And I think that that is a good mentality to have, to try to cover more in less time, because a lot of people are too, especially if they study late into the night. I remember when I used to be, first year uni, I used to feel the night was endless. The endless night, like once everyone goes to sleep, my day begins, I'm like Batman, but with like studying and then notes, the most boring version of Batman. I would enter into the study session late at night and I'd be like, oh, I've got this, I've got an infinite amount of time, my hyperbolic time chamber of studying, but it's, I'm only studying until like 4 a.m. or 5, so it's only like 4 or 5 hours. Well, I shouldn't say only. If you're studying until 4 or 5 a.m., rethink things, please. If you're struggling with studying during the day, having that 4 or 5 extra hours at a reduced level of efficiency and compromising your sleep and all that sort of stuff, the amount of benefit it's really producing to you is like, it's there, but it's kind of minimal. And with enough sleep deprivation, the benefit is going to invert. You're actually doing more harm than good. So trying to study faster and study more in a lot of ways is good. The problem is how we go about cramming that information. So if we're cramming information in a way that makes us kind of just game the system, what's the rubric, what's the keyword, I'm just trying to memorize that and then regurgitate it, that is going to build bad habits, and it's not going to build strong knowledge. And it might be enough to pass the exam, but it's going to create this false understanding of effective learning. And it's going to feel like learning can either be done boring and slow and tediously and repetitively, or it can be done in a cheated sort of way through cramming. And those are the two possibilities. But it's not. There's that third option, which is really the way that we tend to learn from pretty much anything outside of studying, which is a more organic, more authentic, more engaged, usually more enjoyable way, where it's not as repetitive, it's not as boring, and we're able to hold on to that information, more authentically and for a longer term as well. If you're cramming, I think you should be cramming in such a way that the technique is still abiding by like pretty good principles. Like instead of cramming by saying, I'm going to cover all this information in a very short period of time, and therefore I'm going to learn everything just like through pure memorization. You got to think, right? Like if you are learning something through pure memorization, your rate of forgetting is very, very high. And you're trying to compensate for that by basically learning so much in such a short period of time that even if you forget a bunch of it, your exam is so close that it doesn't matter. Well, there are some serious limitations to that. Number one, it's only possible if the amount you're cramming is actually crammable within an extremely short period of time. So if you're cramming something and you can finish the entire topic in a single day and your exam is the next day, then sure, your knowledge decay may be so little that you can actually do decently well. But even then, you're still going to have forgotten maybe 50 to 60% of everything that you covered in reality, because knowledge that is irrelevant is going to disappear very quickly. In fact, sometimes in just minutes, let alone hours or overnight. And obviously, if you now have 2 to 3 days worth of cramming that it requires, and you've got a block of exams, like 2 or 3 exams back to back, and this exam you just crammed for is like, day 2, the time of that first one, and then that your actual exam, there might be 4 days. There's no way you're going to be able to hold on to much information 4 days after when you learn it in an isolated way. It doesn't really happen, Your rate of decay is going to reach like 70, 80% on that. It's just not strategic to do it that way, right? So if you have a very, very small amount of time, the way you should cram for it is just by figuring out what are the biggest points, like the most accessible or the most important. Like these are the things that if I were to learn this, I would probably be able to at least figure out or guess the other answers, even if I didn't learn them properly. So what are those parts of information? And double down on that. Establish what are the concepts that we think are going to be the most important. And what are the concepts that we think, if we know this concept it leverages our ability to think about the topic so that we can figure out some of the other things. Because there's a lot of things where like it will be best if you could actually learn that properly. But actually, if you do something else, then you could almost kind of figure it out. It's sort of like connect the dots. Like if you know that there is this thing and that causes this thing, then you can kind of almost guess generally what's going to happen in the middle. It increases the chance of you kind of getting lucky with a guess. Right, you can read the options and feel like it probably will work, and you can take a stab in the dark, and it can take your guessing chances from, I don't know, like a 25% chance of making a random guess all the way up to maybe a 70% chance, which is pretty good if you haven't even studied it at all. When you start with that, first of all, that's actually good learning practice to layer your learning and learn in those layers anyway. We start with the most important ideas. It scaffolds us and allows us to think about how all the parts in between could be connected, and it gives more relevance to the information. And then if you've got additional time, so let's say you've got 2 days, well, you can start your first day doing that, and on your second day think, well, what's the second level of most important information across the entire topic? Something like cramming, right? In the case of cramming, going lecture by lecture is extremely not efficient, and it doesn't even make sense, because if you're cramming something, it almost basically means you're learning the entire topic in a single go. The idea of a lecture is now essentially meaningless. The only reason the lecture time existed because that's the only amount of 1 or 2 hours for the lecturer to teach it to you. Because otherwise, you're not going to sit there in like a 14-hour continuous class. But when you're cramming, you are essentially learning a 14-hour continuous class about an entire topic. So you may as well think about it that way. One block of topic with one layer of information, the main concepts, scattered between all of the maybe 5 or 6 or 7 lectures. And we do that on day 1. And then we do the next level of detail on layer 2. And then on day 3, we do the next layer, and then so on and so forth. So the more time you have, progressively, the more detail you can get to. The reason this is effective is because a lot of the detail that we spend a lot of time memorizing, that's not stuff that is actually going to get us strategically like a high yield number of marks. Exams are always made with different levels in mind. We want people to pass, we want people to then like show excellence, and then we want to separate out the elite students. If you're cramming this and already your chances of getting that elite level are relatively lower, you can really do very well in the bulk of the question without knowing every exact detail. You can do pretty well just by having a reasonably good logical understanding of the main ideas and understanding how they fit together in such a way that allows you to use the knowledge that you have. I think it's much better to have a very firm understanding of 20 key concepts and exactly how they all relate together, where you can then use that knowledge of 20 key concepts, infer and hypothesize and make pretty good estimates about the 40 related ideas that stem from that, rather than having a surface level understanding of just 60 ideas that are relatively isolated, where you're only getting like 1 unit of benefit for each concept that you're learning. If they test on this concept, yes, you can answer it because you learned about it. But if they test on this concept, you can't, because you can't use the knowledge that you already have to sort of figure it out. This is especially the case in like short answer questions. A lot of short answer questions, you can not necessarily make things up, but you can make a pretty sound argument based on what you know without necessarily going too in depth in some of the details. Yes, you will lose marks in some of those details, but overall you may gain them elsewhere, and it's a lot more strategic. And if you do have the time, you can also, for those details, you can make flashcards on them. You can try to go through those details, last minute, and whatever details you can pick up, it'll be there. But even if you learn all the details, at the end of the day, 90% of the details you study are not even examined. And this is the thing that I always think like about the people that are like reading through their notes like outside the exam room. It's like, what are the chances that you're gonna learn something that you missed that is actually gonna come up in the test? Like, sure, there's that odd story of a student that says like, oh, you know what, that happened to me, but it's like statistically that's very small. And also, how many marks or points did you gain or lose from that single 1 point? It's usually just this anxiety because people have no idea how to control their memory, and therefore they're just like constantly anxious about forgetting things. And that says more about how it was encoded in the first place. So funnily enough, cramming in this way that I just explained would actually make you hold on to more of that information, because each layer is building on a foundation of the previous layer, right? And you could separate this into days, or you could do it like half a day. So like in the morning, I do one, like the main important ones. In the afternoon, I do the next most important ones if it's a small enough topic. Because each consecutive sort of level of learning is building on the previous one, it's more relevant from your brain's point of view. And so it's going to hold on to it more. So you're going to actually retain a greater percentage of what you study as well. And so a lot of that anxiety is going to reduce. So I cram all the time. The only difference is I cram at the very beginning of the semester. I get all my studying done in the first couple of weeks, and then I just chill out. I work full time. I run a business, right? While studying full time, because I can afford to do that luxury because I'm able to cram in a way that is efficient. And the results that I get are the highest you can possibly get.
I think it's definitely very different from the strategy that most people go through. I think a lot of people might have already come across the idea of studying the most high yield topics that are examinable. But I think the key thing to take away here is that we really want to be looking at the biggest ideas of a topic and then building it on layer by layer. And I think I'd just like to share a bit of my experience. So even before I met you and started working with you, I've also found myself in situations where I had to cram my exams. And I think especially for maths, so it really feels like a superpower when you're sitting in an exam, you're like, oh no, I haven't actually studied for this. But when you're able to derive things from first principles, like, oh shoot, I forgot what's this formula. But I know that, hey, this concept's actually related to that concept. I know that these two variables are somehow related. And there's sort of this relationship here and there. Even though I totally forgot the formula, we have no formula sheet, I was able to somehow magically guess the correct formula. And it turned out pretty well.
Yeah. And the thing is actually a lot of the way that you will use your learning in the real world in a professional setting is actually like that. It's not you don't really call it a guess, but this is just the way that knowledge tends to function in the real world. So one of the other things that I'm involved in is medical education, right? Teaching doctors and medical students how to think clinically and make good diagnoses. So when we're teaching people about good clinical reasoning skills, the answer is not to like memorize every single disease and every single symptom within it, and then like look at a patient and just trawl through your library of like 10,000 diseases to figure out what the right one is. It is actually a reasoning process where you're saying, okay, this, and this, and this. And therefore, it probably means something like, if someone says, hey, I've got pain in my chest, it's like, okay, well, pain has to be stimulated by something, and it could be here, or it could be centrally derived. So if it's here, then we start thinking through a system. It could be anatomical. Like if it's anatomical, maybe, it could be affecting the musculature or the skin, or maybe if we go deeper, it's a bony issue. And then we might do an examination, we push against it. Okay, it doesn't hurt when we push against the chest. So less likely to be musculoskeletal. So maybe it's a little bit, close to that. Is it pericardium, or is it the pleural membrane that's being inflamed and being pushed against it? Well, what could cause that? It could be an infection, could be ischemia. So we think about things in this way. So we are using first principles. We're basically connecting dots, and there's a blank in the middle, and we're reasoning through that process. That's the way that real knowledge is used. And it's the same for marketing. It's the same for business. It's even for, learning how to learn and learning science. It's the same for education. It's the same for medicine. So the way that knowledge is really retrieved is relying on you being able to infer and make conclusions based on what you know, not necessarily just regurgitating what you know, but being able to like mentally regurgitate it, but then use that information in another way. Especially now, there's this big trend for curriculums to start testing in a more difficult way so that you can't just regurgitate things. This year it's relevant, but next year it'll be even more relevant, and the year after that it'll be more relevant. The curriculum is constantly trying to make it so that people can't sort of game their way through it. And so being able to really use your knowledge is going to become more and more important, especially for anyone going into later years of university, and especially for postgrad and beyond. Not having these skills is completely incompatible with, let alone excelling, you won't even pass. In summary, I have quite complex thoughts about cramming. Yeah, I think it can be good. I think the way that most people do it is not good, but the concept of cramming in itself is something that I actually do support if it is done the right way.